Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tap that bell icon so you never miss an episode. Today we're tackling a topic that's a mainstay in international relations, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC. The G4 countries and their quest to reform the UN Security Council. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, but we're going to break it down for you, whether you're a seasoned diplomat or just starting to explore the world of global politics. Okay, so let's set the stage. The G4, that's Germany, Brazil, India, and Japan. They're pushing hard for changes to the UN Security Council, arguing that it's outdated and doesn't reflect the current global power dynamics, but they're not just advocating for themselves.
What's really interesting here is how the G4 is framing its argument. They're actually pushing for more countries to have permanent seats on the Security Council, including increased representation for Africa and the developing world.
That seems a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? Wouldn't they want to keep the power exclusive?
You'd think so, right? But their logic is that a more representative council would be more legitimate and effective in tackling global challenges. They're essentially saying, look, we're willing to dilute our own individual power if it means creating a system that works better for everyone.
So it's a long-term strategy aiming to create a more stable and cooperative global order, even if it means giving up some control in the short term. But let's face it, the UN is notorious for its bureaucracy and slow pace of change. There's bound to be pushback, right?
Absolutely. There's a group of countries known as the Coffee Club who are skeptical of the G4's ambitions. They see this as a power grab by larger nations and are concerned about their own voices being marginalized in the process.
So we've got the G4 pushing for change and the Coffee Club resisting. It sounds like a diplomatic tug of war. What are the specific changes the G4 is proposing?
Their main proposal is to expand both permanent and non-permanent seats on the Security Council. They want to add 6 new permanent members initially without veto power and 4 new non-permanent members, bringing the total to 25.
Wait, without veto power initially, what's that all about?
That's a strategic concession on the G4's part. They understand that the existing permanent members, the P5, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, are fiercely protective of their veto power. It's a major source of their influence. By offering to initially forego veto power for new permanent members, the G4 is trying to make their proposal more palatable and get the ball rolling on reforms.
That makes sense. It's like they're saying, look, we're not trying to completely overturn the existing power structure, just make it more inclusive and representative. But I imagine the P5, especially countries like China, might still have reservations, right?
You're absolutely right. China in particular has been cautious about the G4's proposals. They see the Security Council as a key platform for projecting their global influence, and they're wary of any changes that could diminish their power.
So there's this underlying tension between the desire for a more representative UN and the realities of global power politics. It's like everyone agrees the system needs an upgrade, but no one wants to give up their seat at the table. But let's break down the G4's reform plan a bit further. How would these new permanent seats be distributed?
They're proposing 2 seats for Africa, 2 for Asia, 1 for Latin America and the Caribbean, and 1 for Western Europe and other states. The idea is to address the historical underrepresentation of certain regions, particularly the Global South.
So it's about rebalancing the scales of global power, giving a stronger voice to regions that have often been marginalized. But as with any major change, there are bound to be challenges. What are some of the major roadblocks the G4 is facing in its quest for reform?
One of the biggest hurdles is the lack of consensus among UN member states. As we've discussed, the Coffee Club has its own ideas about how reform should happen or if it should happen at all. And even within the P5, there are different opinions about how far-reaching the changes should be.
So it's not just a simple matter of the G4 presenting their proposal and everyone agreeing. There are a lot of competing interests and behind-the-scenes negotiations going on. It sounds like a high-stakes diplomatic chess match with everyone trying to outmaneuver each other.
Exactly. And one of the key battlegrounds in this chess match is the process of negotiations itself. The G4 has been pushing for something called text-based negotiations, which they believe would make the process more transparent and accountable.
Okay, pause for a second. What exactly are text-based negotiations and why are they so important to the G4?
It's essentially a way of formalizing the reform process. It involves drafting a concrete document that outlines the proposed changes, which then becomes the basis for discussions. This approach would provide greater clarity and make it harder for countries to backtrack or shift their positions later on.
So it's about locking in commitments and preventing the process from getting bogged down in endless debates and procedural wrangling. But why would countries like China be opposed to this approach?
For countries like China, the current informal approach offers more flexibility. It allows them to influence the process behind the scenes without having to publicly commit to specific proposals or timelines.
It's the difference between having a clear roadmap and navigating a maze with hidden pathways and shifting walls. And China, with its growing global influence, probably prefers the maze. But for countries like India, who are actively pushing for reform text-based negotiations, would offer a way to hold other countries accountable and ensure that the process moves forward in a meaningful way.
Precisely. It's about leveling the playing field and ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, not just those of the most powerful nations. And this is where the G4's strategic thinking becomes really evident. They're not just advocating for their own permanent seats, they're trying to create a system where emerging powers like India have a real shot at gaining a permanent seat in the future.
So they're playing the long game, betting on the idea that a reformed UN Security Council will ultimately benefit them in the long run, even if it means sharing power with new players. But let's be realistic. Getting 193 countries to agree on something as significant as Security Council reform is a monumental task. What does a successful outcome even look like in this scenario?
The ideal outcome from the G4's perspective would be a Security Council that is more representative, more effective, and more aligned with the realities of 21st century geopolitics. A council that can effectively address the challenges of our time, from climate change to global pandemics, without being bogged down by political gridlock.
It's a lofty goal. But you're right, the current system often seems paralyzed by vetoes and competing national interests. The G4 is essentially arguing that a more inclusive council would be more likely to find common ground and take decisive action on critical issues. But let's talk about one specific aspect of the G4's proposal that I find interesting, the call for expanding both permanent and non-permanent seats. Why not just focus on adding more non-permanent members? Wouldn't that be a simpler, less controversial path?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the debate about power and representation within the UN system. The G4 argues that simply adding more non-permanent members would perpetuate the existing imbalance of power. It would be like adding more voices to a choir, but only giving a select few the power to decide what song to sing.
Right. So it's not just about having a seat at the table, it's about having a say in what's on the menu. But wouldn't adding more permanent members, even without initial veto power, make the Security Council even more unwieldy and prone to gridlock?
It's a valid concern, but the G4 is betting that the benefits of greater representation outweigh the potential risks of increased complexity. They believe that a more diverse council with voices from all corners of the globe would be more likely to find creative solutions to complex problems.
It's a gamble for sure. But, as you said earlier, they're playing the long game. Now let's shift our focus to India for a moment. India has been a vocal supporter of UN Security Council reform. What are some of the specific reasons why India sees this as such a crucial issue?
For India, a permanent seat on the Security Council is about more than just prestige. It's about having a seat at the table where decisions are made that directly impact its interests. It's about ensuring that India's voice, and by extension the voices of other developing nations, are heard and taken seriously on the global stage.
So it's about influence security and having a say in shaping the rules of the global order. But as we've discussed, there are a lot of hurdles to overcome. What are some of the specific challenges India faces in navigating this complex diplomatic landscape?
One of the biggest challenges is managing relations with China. Both countries are vying for greater influence in Asia and on the global stage. And China, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has the power to block any reforms that it sees as detrimental to its interests.
So there's this delicate dance that India has to perform, balancing its desire for reform with the need to maintain a stable relationship with China. It's like walking a tightrope where one wrong step could have serious consequences.
Exactly, and it's not just about China. India also needs to navigate the interests of other key players, including the US, Russia, and the European Union. Building consensus and forging strategic alliances will be crucial to India's success in this endeavor.
It sounds like a diplomatic high-wire act requiring a lot of skill strategy and perhaps a bit of luck. But let's not forget about the Coffee Club. How do they view India's aspirations for a permanent seat on the Security Council?
The Coffee Club's position is complex. Some members see India as a natural fit for a permanent seat given its size, economic power, and contributions to UN peacekeeping operations. Others are more skeptical, viewing India's bid as a challenge to the existing power structure.
So even within the coffee club, there are divisions and competing perspectives. It seems like every country is carefully calculating its own interests and trying to position itself for maximum advantage in this evolving global order. But let's bring this back to the average person, both in India and around the world. Why should they care about UN Security Council reform? What's at stake for them?
At its core, UN Security Council reform is about creating a more just and equitable world order. It's about ensuring that the voices of all nations, not just the most powerful ones, are heard and taken seriously. A more representative Security Council would be more likely to address global challenges that affect everyone, from climate change and poverty to pandemics and conflict.
So it's not just about abstract geopolitical maneuvering. It's about creating a system that is more responsive to the needs of all people, regardless of where they live or what passport they hold. But what are the potential downsides of reform? Are there any risks involved in shaking up the existing power structure?
One of the biggest risks is that the reform process could become bogged down in political gridlock, leading to further division and paralysis within the UN system. Another concern is that a larger Security Council could become less efficient, making it even harder to reach consensus and take decisive action.
So it's a balancing act, weighing the potential benefits of greater representation against the potential risks of increased complexity and inefficiency. And as with any major change, there are no guarantees of success. But the G4, along with countries like India, are betting that the stakes are too high to simply maintain the status quo.
They're arguing that the world has changed, and the UN Security Council must change with it. They're pushing for a system that is more inclusive, more representative, and ultimately more capable of meeting the challenges of the 21st century.
It's a bold vision, and only time will tell whether they can achieve it. But one thing is certain. The debate over UN Security Council reform is not going away anytime soon. It's a debate that will continue to shape the future of global governance and the balance of power on the world stage. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we were talking about all the pluses and minuses of UN Security Council reform and why this issue is so important for countries like India. But let's zero in on India for a second. If India were to get a permanent seat on the Security Council, what would that actually look like in practice?
It would be a pretty big shift in global power dynamics. India would have a direct say in decisions on a whole range of issues, from international peace and security to economic sanctions and humanitarian interventions.
So no more just watching from the sidelines. India would be right in the middle of it all, shaping global policy alongside the other big players. That's a low responsibility, but also a lot of opportunity. What are some specific ways India could use this new influence?
Well, India could use its position to be a champion for developing countries, advocating for a fairer global economic order, and pushing for more cooperation on things like climate change and terrorism.
It's like having a seat at the big table, where you can not only speak your mind, but also amplify the voices of others who've often been ignored. But this power comes with a lot of attention, right? How would India handle all the alliances and rivalries within the Security Council?
Yeah, it would be a delicate balancing act. India would need to keep strong relationships with key players like the US and Russia, while still asserting its own independent stance on issues. And obviously, dealing with the relationship with China would be super important.
It's like a high-stakes chess game where every move has big consequences.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back for a second and think about what all this means for the average person, both in India and around the world. How would a reformed UN Security Council, with India as a permanent member, affect their lives?
A more representative and effective Security Council could create a more peaceful and stable world. It could mean better responses to global crises like pandemics and climate change. It could mean a greater focus on issues that really hit developing countries hard, like poverty and inequality.
So it's not just some abstract political game. It's about creating a world where everyone has a real chance at a better future. A world where the voices of those on the margins are heard and the needs of the many are put before the interests of a few.
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of why this whole debate is so important. UN Security Council reform is about more than just changing who sits where. It's about creating a system that really reflects the global community and can handle the challenges we face in the 21st century.
It's about building a world where power is shared more fairly and decisions are made through dialogue and working together, not by force or going it alone. And that's a goal worth fighting for, even if the road is long and bumpy.
It's a journey worth taking, and the G4's push for reform, along with India's active involvement, is a big step in the right direction.
And on that note, dear deep divers, we've come to the end of our exploration of the G4 countries and UN Security Council reform. We've covered a lot today, from the complexities of global power to how it could impact everyday people.
We've looked at the arguments for and against reform, the challenges and opportunities ahead, and what this debate means for India's place on the world stage.
But this is just the beginning of the conversation. We encourage you to continue your own deep dive into this topic. Check out the sources we've mentioned, look closer at the viewpoints of different countries, and come to your own conclusions.
And don't forget, the world's always changing. The decisions we make today about the future of the UN Security Council will affect global governance for generations.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those brains diving deep. That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed the journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of knowledge and discovery. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.